All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our Conscious Conversations. This evening, I'm very excited to introduce Saskia von Diest to you guys. Saskia and I met, well, a while ago, actually, at a Fort Tobacco ceremony, but I think more recently at a talk that you did in Plet on exactly what we'll be chatting about tonight. So thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Peter, for having me.
So Saskia's in the middle of the UK somewhere on a farm, and the farm internet in South Africa seems to be better than the farm internet in England. So you might find that she breaks up a bit on the video, but the audio seems to be pretty clear.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's not at all, not a problem at all. So the name of tonight's talk, which I'll just paste in here for you guys, is Ecofluency and Interspecies Communication. So we're going to dive into unpicking those words and seeing what they mean. And I thought to begin with, I call this series Conscious Conversations. I'm really aiming at stepping into a high level of awareness and consciousness in the topics and the content we discuss. So, and I mean, I'm sure you have a lot to say about this, Saskia. What is your perspective on that word, conscious?
It's a good question, and it's a big one. I would say that there are many maps that have different understandings of it. I tend to gravitate more towards the Vedic map of seeing consciousness as almost pure awareness. It's that thing which the manifest world uses. It's that thing which uses the manifest world, the material world, to see itself in, to see itself evolve. The Purusha. I would say the long and the short of it, because I could go on about it for ages, but I would say the long and the short of it would be just pure awareness.
Pure awareness. That's pretty far out. We'll ground that a little bit through some other questions. So intuitive and embodied communication with nature is a word that I picked out of a leaflet that you had for the course you were going to run in Plets, but then unfortunately didn't happen. So I want to chat about like what your perspective is on intuitive and intuition, and then on embodiment and how the two relate in our interaction with nature.
Okay. So would you like me to just ramble on a bit about that?
Yes, exactly. Please.
Okay. So, maybe it would help to also tell you a little bit about my background, because it segues beautifully into what I understand and how I researched this and what I found. So I was doing my PhD in plant pathology, agricultural plant diseases, at Stellenbosch University, and that I finished at the end of 2013. But during that PhD, at the end of 2012, I came across Anna Breitenbach's work, and I did a few workshops with her. And many people will know Anna's work from the documentary that was made about her and her work called The Animal Communicator. And that changed my life, because I'd come from a fairly conventional way of thinking, but was wanting to think differently, was wanting to think alternatively, and liked the idea of nature being conscious and self-conscious and being able to be communicated with. But I'd never come across that before, other than in movies and in children's stories and so on. So at the end of my PhD, I went to the vice rector of the university and I asked him, how would he propose I research this with the lens of farming and food growing, because agriculture is the largest interface we have with the rest of nature. So how could I make a difference in understanding how we can talk with the rest of nature in that sphere? And he recommended that I start this postdoctoral research position. And this is now my second postdoc. The first postdoc I did just at Stellenbosch University. The second one I've done is a jointly funded postdoc between Coventry University and Stellenbosch University. And within the last 7 years, I'm close to the end of my second postdoc. Within the last 7 years, it's been quite a journey trying to understand the role of the body and intuition in interspecies communication. And that's something that Anna and many other teachers and consultants and practitioners will talk about, you know, the use of these sensations, the feelings, the emotions, the wider range of the human sensory awareness, in the role of being able to communicate not just with the rest of nature in terms of other than human, but also with each other as humans. And that's something that I've had to learn, which I've used various tools of. Dance has been one of them, movement medicine classes that were held in Cape Town when I was living there. And another big one for me in terms of a methodology that I can use to demonstrate to other people and allow them to have their own embodied experience of the consciousness of nature is constellations, which stems from family constellations. So I'm at the end of my training now in family constellations, and I've specialized or focused more in my training on nature constellations. And that gives people an opportunity to have their own experience, own embodied experience, because I believe that experiential evidence is really what's not just going to change your way of thinking, not that one needs necessarily to be just convinced, but to actually change your way of thinking of the world, your ontology as it is, or your epistemology. And these are words that people talk about in the philosophy of science, but it doesn't enter mainstream conversation that often, and it really should, because that's the big difference that I struggled with. Before I went to Anna's workshops, I was thinking that I need to try and find as much scientific evidence for this as possible. And there is scientific evidence out there, but it's not that much. And that's because it's been very often dismissed. And then you've got people like Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who's done research, very rigorous, statistically sound research in this. But it's still been dismissed as pseudoscience because it just doesn't fit within the ontology and the epistemology of modern science, which believes in the materialistic, reductionist, positivist mindset and believes that the world can only be explored using that method, using the modern scientific method. But there are many scientific methods. And again, they're just methods, and they can evolve, and they can, as they evolve, we evolve. So I've been exploring what is my relationship with methodologies. And through that, I've realized that embodiment is a big part of it. And mindfulness. And I mean, all of these are buzzwords in themselves and practices, whole practices within themselves. But in terms of bringing it back to ecofluency, I would say that it's just a part of it. And I can go into ecofluency a bit if you'd like.
Please, that would be fantastic, yeah.
So ecofluency is made up of two parts of the word. Eco comes from the Greek oikos, which has to do with household, but it also relates to habitat. So if one thinks of nature as our home, wider nature, including like not just your house with your four walls and so on, but also the garden and the forest beyond that, or the sea, outside, wherever you live, the fields, they're also your home. It's just that we think of our built home as being the only home. So oikos relates to the habitat, relates to the house. And fluency comes from Latin fluentum, which means not just in terms of flowing, and like when you become fluent in a language, or as smooth as water flows, but it also relates to being relaxed. So what that means when you put them together is not just the ability to speak in a fluent way and dialogue with the rest of nature, but also just to just be, because that absolute relaxedness, that sense of not feeling driven just to do the whole time, but to be able to just be, is actually what we see animals able to do, what we see plants and insects and microbes doing all the time. And we struggle as humans very often to get stuck in our heads. And I know that for me is very often the case. So ecofluency is a concept, is a movement, it's a practice, it's a term to describe using interspecies communication. It incorporates interspecies communication, but it's something that applies it to more than just being able to dialogue with nature, but actually finding out how can we be better relatives. So relationship has to do with our relatives, and how can we be better relatives to the rest of nature. And I want to point out that the rest of nature, I say that deliberately because obviously we are nature, and we talk about wanting to connect to nature, and that means not just exploring the rest of nature out there, but exploring the inner landscape as well as the outer landscape. And all of that is tied in with each other.
Sure, that's amazing. Okay.
So I mean, I could keep on going, but I don't know if you have any specific questions or if the audience have any questions.
No, keep going. We'll do questions at the end.
Okay, so so during my research, I've come across so this idea of ecofluency actually came about because I was reviewing a paper on ecoliteracy. And ecoliteracy is the idea of being able to read into the book of nature. How well can you read a landscape? And this relates to interspecies communication because very many people use tracking as a form of being able to communicate with nature. And it is. If one looks at the Khoisan, John Young actually described this when he was talking about tracking, is one is able to see the silver threads that move through the landscape on a psychic level. And it's not something that's visible to the Western eye necessarily. And the idea of using tracking is a way of reading the landscape. And so ecoliteracy touches on that. But I had the idea of ecofluency came in because I thought to myself, okay, but reading into the book of nature assumes a few things. One is that the book is something that's static, it's there. So in order to understand it, you have to use your intelligence to read between the lines, so to say. You're almost reading the lips and the body language of nature in the same way that a vet maybe would try and find out what's going on with an animal just by figuring out the symptoms and the tests and its behavior and what's been going on, what's wrong with the animal. But there's another way of doing it, and that's to be able to just ask the animal directly. So then I thought, okay, that's where ecofluency comes in. It's going beyond just reading into the book of nature. It's being able to become that book, become part of the book of nature. And I know this sounds very theoretical, and I could give you a few examples where it becomes a more practical, embodied thing. And that is why in my postdoc, I was trying to find out how do farmers actually use this in their practical management of decision making. And many farmers do this. Sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's not. So when you talk about, yeah,
I want to get into farming in a minute. That's going to be great because how it applies to growing food, even if you're on a small scale homestead or for farming is fantastic. I'm curious though, I mean, coming from obviously a very studied background and then moving into, something that's kind of like coming from the rational to the irrational. How was that process for you? I mean, it must have been quite a wild ride.
it has been. And it's been, I often think to myself, I spent 8 years up until the end of my PhD, I spent 8 years building up a specific way of thinking. And I've spent the last 7 deconstructing that, decolonizing it, and restructuring, evolving it, growing out of it and growing with it and exploring beyond it. So I just want to touch on that. The irrational part of it, interspecies communication is not irrational. It incorporates intuition, and very often people think of intuition as being irrational, and they polarize the logic with the intuitive side. And within the theory of psychology, for example, we have these 2 systems of thinking, and the one is the logical, rational mind, which evolved, so to say. We don't know for sure, but this is what the theory is. It evolved after the more intuitive way of thinking, and intuition is actually a way of thinking, but because it's immediate, because we don't know where the information comes from, because it's very often accurate and it includes bodily sensations. It doesn't just happen, in our brains, in our minds, so to say. Sorry. People think of it as being irrational, but there's more and more recognition that actually just because we don't know how it works and where the information comes from doesn't mean it's not A, useful, and B, accurate. And that's why the intuitive farming. So very often farmers would talk about how they have an intuition about what to do. And that's because, yes, it's something that arises within them that they don't know where it comes from. And I very often use that as a segue for intuitive communication, which is another term for interspecies communication. Because if we don't know where it comes from, who's to say it doesn't actually come from somewhere else in nature? If it's not within ourselves, if we're having an intuition, let's say the intuitive sense between twins or between a parent and a child, that's very strong. Who's to say that information doesn't actually come, and I want to say telepathically, from another being? And there's a stigma attached to telepathy, which is why I try and steer away from it, unfortunately. But it's true. There is a mind-to-mind, a heart-to-heart connection between bodies that more and more scientific evidence is accumulating for, or that more and more people are doing research into it that builds a scientific evidence that supports the idea, so to say.
Supports it from the current scientific framework.
Exactly, with the current epistemology.
Yeah, and whether or not you believe in the framework, you can get practical results from using techniques and becoming sensitive enough to pick that up. I mean, it must be a huge part of the process, is just tuning yourself to that level of sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly. It is a practice. And it's something that Anna Breitenbach will talk about. I think she even mentioned it in her documentary, where she describes it as being supernatural. So that's not that it's a capacity that only a few special people have. It's very natural, supernatural in terms of it being, our birthright in a way. And it's something that we're born with, and many you will have it to different abilities, but it's not something that is encouraged when we're children. And it's something that many people are realizing, oh, but actually I have these experiences on either regular or irregular basis, or I have this memory from childhood. And when they're reminded of it and they hear other people talk about it, it becomes a sort of intersubjective validation. They're able to acknowledge to themselves that it's something real and it's something useful. And it's just a matter of finding ways to develop that capacity within ourselves.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I remember doing the course with Anna. Baron and I did it actually while Baron was pregnant with Katara in Mozambique, and communicating with dolphins, then going to swim with them, and the little baby dolphins coming and visiting us. I mean, it was wild, because quite often you think, yeah, I'm just making it up, right? The stuff I'm getting, I'm just making it up, and that's kind of right too, and that's okay. And being okay with you making it up and then getting results based on that, you build the confidence that you're getting accurate information.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that as much as it is being made up, you can also discern between what is your imagination that you're projecting into a real message and into action, and what is actually coming from another being. And that's something that, for example, Rudolf Steiner, who's the founder of biodynamic farming, or his work was the founding premise for biodynamic farming. He talks about intuition, imagination. I mean, he talks about imagination and then inspiration and then intuition as being these consequential steps that build you up to be able to accessing higher knowledge. And when you switch on your imagination and you allow it to go wild, you also start activating that psychic ability. And there are all these terms which get lumped, into the sort of new age camp and the woo-woo and crazy talk, but there's something there. And I've had my own direct experiences. I've seen other people have them, and I love it when people can have experiences that they can validate. So very often what happens in workshops when you're learning interspecies communication is you'll have a picture, for example, of an animal. That's what typically is done. And you ask the animal questions, and you don't even have to be having the animal in front of you, because the picture of that animal acts like the holographic signature, so to say, the frequency signature of being able to, like a telephone number, so you know who you're talking to. So you communicate with the animal, you ask it questions, and then afterwards you can find out where your answer is actually correct. And what's always so surprising and wonderful and inspiring and validating is when you find out how many of your answers are actually correct and meaningful. And it's not just about it being accurate, but Dr. Matthew Zelstra is also a colleague of mine and a good friend, and he talks about this idea of meaningful. And that's actually a big part of intuitive or interspecies communication and ecofluency, is the making of meaning. And Monica Gagliano talks about this. Dr. Gagliano has done a lot of research in communicating with plants and finding out more about plant intelligence. And she has a practice of her own when she communicates with plants. And I find that highly inspiring, because she talks about, is it not just useful, but is it also meaningful? And that's actually I would say, the core of it, because in the end of the day, if you're going back to why are we here, and nobody really has the answer to that, but if one of the things we're doing is to try and increase our awareness, to raise our consciousness, so to say, which I would say is raising awareness, becoming more mindful of our everyday lives, how can we, from a Vedic perspective, dissolve our karma? How can we grow as humans? How can we be of service to others? It's all about finding meaning, making meaning, and very often that meaning, with its, I don't know what the right term for it is, meaningfulness, can be useful, but sometimes it doesn't have to be practically useful. Sometimes it's just about enriching your life on a different level. But my focus has always been on the more practical side of it as a researcher.
Fantastic. Well, we can get into that in a minute. I mean, I must say that experientially, I've been lucky to be in, ceremonial spaces, with Mother Ayahuasca, where if I hold the vision, as you said, the holographic imprint of someone in my mind, there's no doubt that I have them in front of me and I'm communicating with them. It's as obvious as the sun shining on a sunny day on your arm. And, the validation that comes where I'll have a conversation and I'll get feedback from them. And then the next day I'll actually make physical contact with them, and they'll absolutely corroborate what is going on for them in our communication. And so, sure, I mean, it's a powerful, practice to hold people or hold, plants, animals, anything. I mean, you can communicate anything by holding them.
Have you had an experience of being able to communicate with a plant or an animal or some other being that's not human in nature, that hasn't been facilitated by
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, the a state change always helps you to get out of your standard perspective of linear reality. But an experience that I had, outside of that realm, which gave the same results, we had a massive fire here on our farm last year, and I mean, absolutely huge, decimated hundreds of square kilometers around the area. And we were actually in Cape Town at the time, and the fire was bearing down on our farm. And Bear and I just sat in meditation and connected consciously to all of our plants around our house, brought them all into our, because we planted them all ourselves over the years. So we have a direct link to them. And we just said, guys, time to put up your shields. There's big fire coming, like protection, protection, protection. And we did this, for hours and just held the focus. And I mean, everything around the house was obliterated, and there wasn't a single bit of damage in our house and around the house and in our garden. I mean, the flames are literally like the tree line's 30 meters and the flames are 40 meters on top of that. So, and they were right over the house everywhere. I mean, it's pine trees. They just explode like an inferno. Wow. So, that was a pretty profound visceral experience of that.
That is a powerful experience and a powerful story to tell. Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly the same as a very close friend of mine in Greece, Eleni Gikaki, and she's also a very, very experienced animal communicator, and she uses it also in her consulting work for holistic animal nutrition. But more than that, she also has been using it in deepening her own connection with nature and capacity to dialogue with nature. And the same thing happened at her place, where she had this massive wildfire that happened, and she communicated with the fire directly. And she was asking, I won't go into the story because it takes quite long, but the long and the short of it is that the fields and the hills all around her for kilometers and kilometers all got obliterated, like you said. And the boundary line around the property where they're staying, where they're renting, literally razor sharp along the line, along the fence line. That's where the fire ended.
Exactly. Straight off to the fire, take people for walks around, and I'm like, have a look at that. Tell me if you can explain that. And you'll see like trees vaporized, and then suddenly trees perfect, like next to each other.
So one thing I want to just mention about this is that within agriculture, one can use tools like one uses entheogens for communicating. You can also use entheogens or hallucinogens, as people call them, plant medicines. You can use homeopathic doses of preparations, like, for example, biodynamic preparations of Three Kings. There's Three Kings preparation when I went to a workshop once, a farmer was describing how he used this on the borders of his farm. And so he doesn't have his own direct communication or relationship in terms of speaking with his farm. as an entity. But at the same time, that's what the preparation did for on his behalf. And he had the same thing. And that's what we find, is that you can use things that aid your communication in some way and help build your strength and your immunity and that of the farm, but also build your relationship in terms of dialogue. And in the end of the day, it's about being able to be in harmony with the rest of nature. In whichever way you find that, it's like, whatever works, do that. Anything that helps. And I believe that direct communication is, to me, like the key, because our body is that perfect instrument that you can use. And at the same time, we don't have access to, maybe we've forgotten, we've lost, and we need to regain that capacity. But in the meantime, the training wheels, anything helps. Devices, instruments, they all help, like radionic, dowsing, and anything like that within agriculture helps.
I really enjoyed reading The Secret Life of Plants many years ago, which
Wow.
there's a whole bunch of amazing experiments, particularly the polygraph ones, where plants recognize people coming through the door. They respond even at vast distances to people thinking about them. I mean, if anyone hasn't read that, it's a fantastic book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that book, also the work of Stephen Harrod Booner. So he talks about plant intelligence, and Dr. Monica Gagliano, who wrote Thus Spoke the Plant, or Thus Spoke the Plant. I never know how to say thus. So she's a fantastic researcher who's currently bringing out more and more work on her work with that, just to plug that.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you. So let's get into some, like, you must have had quite a few experiences with, because you work with farmers too, and how they work with the land. I remember you telling me, you were asking them, you're supposed to do it this way, but you're not, you're doing it a different way. So tell us a bit about your experiences with farmers and, how they are working with land and intuition and making decisions.
Okay. So firstly, I got into this because I believe that many farmers are doing this on a level that they're not maybe even fully conscious of. But those farmers that are conscious of it, that camp is divided more or less into 2 or 3. Some of them are very open about it, and they're willing to speak to anybody about it because they feel confident and they have the proof of what's changed in their life and on their farm. Some of them are open to speaking about it only off record. And the moment I would start recording for the sake of my interviews, for my research, they would not speak anymore about it. And I understand it, even though I described the confidentiality contracts I have, and I went through ethical research practices to make sure that their identity is protected. They still just didn't want to talk about it on record. And the other camp of farmers is that they're aware of them doing this, but they'll speak to very few people and they will never speak on record about it, or even that much to you, because whether it's out of fear or I'm not sure, maybe they just don't feel that they want to share that. And all of that is, whatever camp somebody fits in, that's totally fine. What I'd like to try and find a way of doing is to encourage farmers to speak more about it, because the more they do that, the more they can help other farmers do the same thing. So one of my favorite examples is a farmer in the Netherlands who doesn't mind me mentioning his name, Jan Dirk van der Voort, and his farm is called Remeke. And it's a dairy farm. And in the 90s, it's a family farm that's been in their family for generations, for hundreds of years. And I believe hundreds of years. Anyway, it's a multi-generational farm. I tend to forget with all the farmers I've interviewed. And what he found is, so they became organic in the 90s already, and then they moved to being the only farm that doesn't use any antibiotics or vaccines in 2004, which is a very, very big step in a country where you legally are required to do that. And when he filled in the forms that he didn't apply any antibiotics or vaccines, they almost didn't want to give him the correct licensing or whatever certification to be able to sell his products. And he just kept saying to them, we don't need it because our disease incidence is so low. So the issues that they had, health issues with their cows, had decreased massively because they'd been using holistic practices. and alternative remedies for the farm. So they treat both the cows and the land with homeopathic remedies, for example. But more than that, they communicate directly with the cows and they ask them, how are you doing? So that they can find out if something's going wrong, because sometimes you will feel in your body when you're ill before you actually show a physical symptom. And that's what they're trying to get at, is being able to detect disease far earlier and be able to treat it so that it doesn't become a full-blown problem. So the idea is about rectifying the issues by first trying to find balance and harmony on the farm. So they'll communicate directly with the soil, with the cows, with, I think, even the mice in the cheese, the cheese, what do you call it, where they make the cheese. I forget the name of the place, but anyway, they've come up with some really interesting ways of farming by co-creating with nature. And one of the ways they've done this is by redesigning the barn. So in a conversation, Jan Dirk actually designed this farm to not be just rectangular, but to be oval more and to be rounded at the sides. And because his cows still have their horns on, which is something that they've shifted their practice to, having the cows rather keep their horns as opposed to cutting them off like they used to, which is a common practice in the dairy industry. They realized that the cows actually were describing how if they're fed the wrong thing, that's why they become aggressive. But even if they fed the right thing, which is more in harmony with their natural diet, they're still going to not want to be penned in. And the moment a cow is in a corner, it will naturally feel like it's backed into a corner. I mean, that's something that any mammal will feel, whether you're a predator or you're prey. So by having a building that has no corners, they're able to move more freely. And the stress levels of their cows are much lower. The mortality of their calves is like almost zero now. Their productivity is far higher. The quality of their products is so high that they've won international awards, and their products are being sought after by Michelin star chefs and restaurants. And their profit has also increased. So these are just some of the benefits, that they've seen. Their costs have gone down, their inputs have gone down. And he's one of the kinds of farmers who speaks openly about this. And he runs workshops with the local agricultural college as well. There's another farmer who actually who's South African. He's not a farmer anymore, but he's fantastic. He used to raise goats and pigs for meat, and he found that if before he started communicating with the animals, it would be a bit of a difficult relationship to foster, because you're raising these animals to be able to kill them for meat. But he found that when he started explaining to the mothers while the kids and the piglets were still in the mother's womb, when he started explaining to them both prenatal as well as postnatal why he was raising them, why they were being bred and raised, and that he would give them the best life possible, the behavior of the animals changed. The quality of his meat was really high, and he also he was able to increase the price of his meat. But more than that, on the day of slaughter, the animals would file quietly, single file, up into the truck that would be taken to the slaughterhouse, which is really powerful. So I'm not saying that that is the correct way of being, but I don't believe that the meat industry is going to go away that quickly. So if there can be a transition period where animals can be looked after in a more ethical way, by being it a more co-creative relationship with them, then that is at least a stepping stone until we can find as a species a way of nourishing ourselves and having everybody believe that they can nourish themselves that is entirely without meat. And this is a kind of story that I've heard from multiple farmers and by colleagues of mine who've worked with farmers, for example, in France. And it took communication to improve something on a farm which no other practice was able to manage.
Oh, that's amazing. And I expect those sheep were probably freaking out before he started his communication process, which is not great for anyone.
No, exactly. The animals, obviously, they would have a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in their bodies, and they were fighting. They didn't obviously want to go into the truck for the slaughterhouse, but the fact that there's such a massive shift in behavior, it's telling. And he gave them the best life he could give them, while they were alive. And the day before slaughter, he explained to them, this is what's going to happen. He walked them through the process. And in a way, one could almost expect that those animals, if one looks at it with a different lens, there are worldviews that incorporate the idea of soul contracts between beings, between different species. And if one explores a possibility that maybe there's an agreement between humans and certain animals that live in close contact or in close proximity with them, whether it's rats, whether it's mice, whether it's cows, whether it's dogs, cats, whatever they are, horses, there tends to be, it seems, there tends to be something within the nature of that relationship where, if one thinks of consciousness, we're teaching each other a lot about each other and about ourselves through mirroring each other. And that, I believe, the learning curve can be increased a lot if there's communication, as is the case with any relationship. Communication is key. Trust and respect. And the first way you build that is by communicating.
Sure. So maybe that perfectly moves into, if I've got a garden, or one of our listeners have a garden, what do you reckon, or even animals, like what kind of practices do you recommend for people to get more in touch with that, open up that communication more, and, what kind of results can people expect to see from that? I mean, I know in my own garden, I have certain plants, actually a few cannabis plants that I look after very nicely out in the open. And Katara, my daughter, she always pets them too, and it's amazing. Like the ones that we put attention on, they're like so happy, and the ones that we kind of ignore off into the distance, like yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And the first thing I would say is, what is the nature of the relationship to begin with? If it's a plant that is a plant you're growing as a crop or for food, that's going to be a different relationship to a kind of plant that you have as a weed, or that you consider a weed, which is still essentially part of the ecosystem, has its purpose, can be food and can be medicine. So it depends on what your starting point is. And this is where I draw from constellations as a methodology to explore what is the dynamic of the relationship, and can it be seen as it truly is to start with? And then how can one move towards harmony? And something that my teacher said to me recently, which I found so beautiful, is that you cannot really separate from something by cutting it out. You separate by connecting. So before I get into the how can you do it yourself at home kind of thing, I'm going to just talk about the idea of, in biodynamics, we use, I'm not a biodynamic practitioner, but in biodynamics, practitioners will use what they call, I think it's ashing. I forget the name of it, but the idea of using a homeopathic dose of something that you don't want on your property, whether it's foxes or whether it's a certain plant that's growing there, whether it's deer, baboons, whatever you don't want to have on the property, increase the frequency of what's there so that the system believes there's enough of that being, that presence, that frequency within the system, so that more is not really, I wouldn't say permitted, but more is not welcome. So for example, people would get a little bit of the fur of a baboon, or I don't know how you would get that, or like if they find baboon bones lying around, they would use some of that, and you prepare it in a ritualistic way. And I don't necessarily mean that in terms of shamanic, but there are certain guidelines one can use when making these preparations, and you can apply it onto the field so that it is so that the system believes that there's more of that there. So anyway, that's just a sidebar.
No, that's fantastic. I actually have someone I know in my area. He programs crystal mats with a piezoelectric effect, and they have a resonance generator, so they can put the frequency of any pest in your environment into it, and then this device will emit it. And he said they've had amazing results with all sorts of things.
I believe that. I mean, many radionics practitioners have found the same thing. You're transmitting this frequency of something that you don't want to have more of in the field, or you want to have less of, so to say. So in terms of communicating with your own beings in your garden, for example, your plants, the short and the sweet of it is something that I've taught some school kids, which is building the golden thread, which a little girl in my life recently was describing as building a golden river. So the heart seems to play a very big role in the intuitive connection as well as in intuitive communication. So sit in a peaceful position, imagine, or even go and sit with the plant there, and imagine that as you're building that connection, I often think of like a figure of 8. I build like a figure of 8 connection with that being, and it doesn't have to have a heart for this to work. This is the beauty of it, is that there's consciousness in everything, and that's an animistic worldview, and that's my personal worldview, is that consciousness pervades everything. So you can communicate with the piece of consciousness, so to say, in that being by connecting through your heart, and you imagine that you're connecting with the soul, for lack of a better term, of that being, and you notice what arises in you. For some people, they'll receive it in mental images, they'll receive it as sensations in their body, as emotions. Whatever arises, notice it. And I have to say that this is something that is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the better it gets, the stronger it gets. So don't be discouraged if at first you're not getting very much, but every bit counts. And the fact that you're doing it, even if you get nothing, is actually what the rest of nature wants us to do. So finding a way of just being present with plants helps. Ingesting those plants also helps, because you're helping to so-called attune your own frequency to that being. So for example, even if you've had ayahuasca once, you don't really need to have it again in order to be able to tune in with that being. You can attune with it outside of it, but it just depends on how much your capacity is developed for that. I would also recommend going to workshops with people like Kate Miller in the Garden Route. I know you're in the Garden Route. She's a fantastic animal communicator and very proficient, and she gives workshops. I'm going to be building a website in the next few months with resources and with some course material, so to help people with developing their capacity. There's not really a quick shortcut, but it starts with something that's very simple, and it might not feel easy at first, but it does get easier. And even if you feel nothing and you get nothing, it doesn't mean that it's not meaningful and enriching, because for the rest of nature it is.
It's kind of how you started it. You just got to be in that space, right? Just be present to nature and let that flow happen.
Yeah, it's about embodiment. The more time you spend outside, the more time you spend with nature, and more in your body. If whether you're doing something physically, or whether you're just noticing what's happening in your body as you go about your day, that all helps. That all helps towards finding harmony with ourselves and with everything.
And sure, I suppose when you recognize that you can communicate with literally any aspect of consciousness in your environment, then fear of viruses is kind of silly.
Exactly. They're a natural part of our ecosystem, and they can even communicate with the viruses. I've communicated with the flu virus in my body before, and as I started getting, this is years ago, I started getting symptoms, and I said to the virus, I understand that you're part of my body forever, but please, I can't get ill now. As a host, I willingly accept that you are here, but please, no symptoms now. And all the symptoms I had, like the headaches, the grogginess, the body pains, the aches, and so on, the sort of unwell feeling, it disappeared within 5 minutes.
Sure. Well, there we go. That's profound for people to practice.
I don't know. I can't say it would work with everybody. I don't know how many viruses it works with, but I certainly know that it is possible to communicate with anything.
Fantastic. And I suppose that goes for things like nature spirits too, the beings that tend your garden when you're not there.
Exactly. And the reason why, that was exactly why I said that it's meaningful to the rest of nature, is because the nature spirits require us with physical bodies to be engaging in the ritual, even if it just looks as simple as sitting there and talking with the plant. It strengthens the capacity, it strengthens the nature spirit's energy to be able to do their work of structuring and upholding the physical, the manifest world of what we see. But without that, we don't drum in circles, dance around fires as much as we used to. And so their strength also starts waning. And people like Susan Raven and Beth Ray, or I forget, there's some fantastic people that describe practices that you can do to both communicate with nature spirits, but also just strengthen them so that they can do their work as part of the ecosystem, the unseen ecosystem.
Sure, that's fantastic. So much good stuff there.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much time we have left. I could babble on about this, but I want to like space for questions.
No, let's open it up. I think we've gone through some great stuff. I mean, the takeout really is get into your garden, and if you don't have a garden, well, just sit wherever you are and connect to all your plants and all your animals and all the people you love, and just send them love and give them some attention.
You can even speak with your food and imagine the food chain or the way in which it got to your plate. That's a way of connecting with it, because in that way you can nourish the soil energetically by imagining that you're talking with the soil where your food came from.
I love that because, what did Einstein say? Spooky action at a distance, I've always loved that. Someone says, what's healthy food? I'm like, healthy food is food that's loved. Well, what is that? Well, it's grown with love. It's harvested with love. It's intentionally produced with love. It's prepared with love. It's eaten with love. But love is throughout that process, whether or not those people in those steps did it, you can do it for them. And that's where like the prayerful attitude to eating, where you sit and then you have gratitude and you send love through the channel, it can change the nature of that food completely.
Exactly. And we have no idea what ripples we have when we drop our pebble of our action in the sort of the sea of activity. We don't know what's actually going to happen, but there's some kind of an impact. And again, constellations shows that within systems, you can change something just so small and it has ripple effects that can affect an entire system, and also in the past, which I find really interesting.
Yeah. Native Americans, 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind is what we control, right?
Exactly.
Sure. Okay, great. Any questions, guys, for Saskia? Now's your chance.
If people don't have any questions now, they can always just contact me directly by email, and I can answer any questions. And in the next, few months, I'm going to be setting up a website, and they can follow the Facebook page I have for Ecofluency, which I'll be announcing that kind of thing on. And I also promote other people's work that go into Ecofluency or interspecies communication. So there are many resources out there. It's just a matter of accessing them.
That's fantastic. Well, this chat is being recorded and we'll put it on our website with all the others, and then we'll put the links there for your Facebook page and people can access that. And when you've got your site done, just send us a link and we'll add it to that for people who listen in the future.
Great, thanks, Peter. I mean, I've organized and I've co-facilitated like 15 workshops in the last 6 years around interspecies communication and quantum-based agriculture, which is, intuitive farming is one aspect of quantum thinking in agriculture. And what I found is that there's more interest in this than I thought, and it's more widely practiced than is believed. And it's something that I believe, and many people agree with, is needed more of in the world.
Absolutely. The fundamental disease is disconnection from our own intrinsic nature and from nature as a whole.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. So I'm looking forward to doing your course again. Hope you come back to the Garden Route soon once they see some sense and start allowing travel.
Yeah, I'm going to find a way of coming back to South Africa at some point, even if it's just for a visit. Yeah, so I'll be in and out, and there are online resources for this. I'll be also putting together some stuff in the coming months. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and experience with us. I'm sure we all got a lot out of it.
So did I.
For everyone who's listening, I think next week we're going to have a break and then we'll start again the week after with Dr. Raoul Goldberg. We'll be talking about some fascinating stuff. I love Raoul's work.
Yeah, he's great. Wow. And also, I just wanted to say, people like you had recently, Carly,
Esther Hazen.
Esther Hazen, yeah, on your as part of the conversations, and she does a lot of embodied work, and that goes towards being able to intuitively connect and communicate with nature. So yeah. I'm sure that there are other people out there who can also help, and thank you just for letting me chat about this stuff. More and more I'm finding that by just not holding back and staying in that sort of scientist researcher thing, but the more I just speak freely and openly about it, the more it invites that authenticity and that openness in others. And I'm hoping that it helps with the question of what is consciousness and how do we raise it and how do we expand it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. Cool. So let's just have a look at everyone who's chatting, and we can unmute everyone maybe, and maybe, I don't know, mute pass. Oh, there we go.
I also just want to say I'm sorry for the internet connection, and yeah, I'm really sorry. Also for the video and the audio, but yeah, maybe there's a way in the future of having better internet and I can share this more with people.
No, it was actually pretty good, as it turns out. So
okay.
Everyone's unmuted, so we can all say good night, and thank you very much, Saskia, and have a fantastic evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, awesome. Ciao. Have a lovely evening.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.